We'll start. So welcome to the University of Connecticut Brain Imaging Research Center Speaker Tag Series. I am the host, Fumiko Haft, Director of BIRC and Professor of Psychological Sciences, Mathematics, Neuroscience, and Psychiatry. This speaker series is unique in that the speaker tags or nominates the next speaker, also known as the Ponzi Scheme Speaker Series. I say this because once we get a good speaker, then we tell the next speaker that all these great speakers talk and have spoken before, and you're nominated as the next speaker, and we've hardly gotten a no. So I recommend this style if you are planning a speaker series in the future, and we get fantastic speakers as we do today, who is Dani Bassett. Let's see, we started this in April with Danielle and Sari. Before this, we had in-person hybrid version, but we went all virtual in April, like many others did, starting with Danielle and Sari, then Lucina Udin, then Nathan Sprung, and now Dani Bassett. We've had about 100 and 200 people each session from over, was it 60 or 80? I'm sorry, I forgot the number already, Lizzie, but 60 or 80 institutions joining, participating from all over the world. Except for in Asia, it's a little hard, I know, to participate at this time of day. As you can see in this slide, you can view previous recordings from wonderful speakers such as Tor Wager, Tim Noble, and so on our website. You can also sign up to get updates on our talk series by emailing Lizzie that you see on this email here, elizabeth.collin@uconn.edu. And I'm delighted to announce our next speaker after Dani gives two talks, a two-part series. And this will be in mid-June. It is Daphne Shohami from Columbia University, who is internationally known for her work in learning, memory, and decision-making. So some housekeeping items, it's in the chat box, but you will be muted except for at the beginning and end. We will try to unmute all in case you can and would like to clap. It's always nice to feel like you're not talking just to the computer, but you actually have the audience in front of you. If you have questions, please enter it in the chat box, and if it seems urgent, I will interrupt the speaker, and otherwise we will take them at the end. I will also be moderating while admitting people, as I am doing now, and checking the chat box, so I apologize for my distractedness. So let's get started. Today it is our great pleasure to introduce Professor Danielle Bassett. Dani is the J. Peter Skorkanich Professor at the University of Pennsylvania with affiliations in the departments of bioengineering, physics, astronomy, electrical and systems engineering, neurology, and psychiatry. She is also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. She's most well known for her work blending neural and systems engineering to identify fundamental mechanisms of cognition and disease in human brain networks. So I have known her work through Mike Gazzaniga when he was giving a keynote, I believe at CNS. It could have been Learning in the Brain conference, I apologize, but this was in San Francisco many years ago. Dani was his postdoc back then, and he kept on raving about his postdoc called Dani Bassett, and then he gave his keynote, and as with all famous senior scientists, he had hours and hours of talk, which he had to condense to 45 minutes or an hour. And he kept on talking about his earlier fabulous work, but earlier work. And then by the time his keynote time was over, he never got to Dani Bassett's slides. So then he started saying that he didn't have enough time. He flashed through all the amazing looking brain network pictures. And then he said he had to skip all those, never talking about her actual work. And then he skipped to the conclusion. So since then, for many years, I've been waiting to hear from her directly. And it's a dream come true for me, and I'm sure for many others, to hear her give a talk today. So she received a BS in physics from Penn State University and a PhD in physics from University of Cambridge as a Churchill Scholar and as an NIH Health Science Scholar. Following a postdoctoral position at UC Santa Barbara with Mike Gazzaniga and others, she has, and she did that before she moved to University Pennsylvania. She has received multiple prestigious awards, including the American Psychological Association's Rising Star, Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow, MacArthur Fellow Genius Grant, Early Academic Achievement Award from IEEE, Harvard Higher Education Leader, NSF Career, Popular Science Brilliant 10, Lagrange Prize in Complex System Science, and Erdos Renyi Prize in Network Science, and I'm abbreviating. You may have thought it was a long list, but I'm not saying all of the awards that she has won. She's the author of more than 280 peer-reviewed publications with over 21,000 citations. She's the founding director of the Penn Network Visualization Program, a combined undergraduate art internship and K-12 outreach program, bridging network science and the visual arts. Her work has been supported by NSF, NIH, you name it, the Army Research Office, as well as Laboratory, Office of Naval Research, DoD, Paul Allen Foundation, ISI Foundation, and Swartz Foundation. So I know I took longer than I usually do, but it was necessary to cover a tiny bit of all her accomplishments. So please join me in welcoming Danny. So I'm going to try to unmute it just so that people can clap. We're very excited to have you. I'm going to mute everyone.
Give me that. Give me that.
Oops, sorry, let me mute everyone. Mute all is not working. Let's see. I'll try to mute while you get started. How's that?
Okay. I think I've attempted to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the...
I'm sorry, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
I apologize.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. I'm very excited to be part of this TAG Speaker Series. It's such a great idea. And thank you for inviting me. The talk that I wanted to give today is on science as culture, and it's a little bit different than the normal talks that I give on brain network architecture and dynamics, and I'll eventually be giving that sort of talk next in 2 weeks' time. But today what I wanted to focus on is this topic because it's relatively a new area of work in the lab, and I think it's exciting and timely. So just to get started, here's the outline for the talk. I want to go through 3 topics. The first topic is just seeing neuroimaging as a really fantastic, time-evolving interdisciplinary field. I'm extremely proud to be part of this field. I think it's a wonderful time to be in neuroimaging, and I wanted to share some of that enthusiasm with you, backed up by a lot of science. And then in section 2, I wanted to talk about neuroscience and how it more generally, so more generally than just neuroimaging, and how it is currently facing several inequities. And I'll try to describe a few of them. And then in section 3, I want to talk through a few of the tools that my lab is developing to try to mitigate disparity. So with that, let's move into section 1. So the team that was involved in this particular work is number 1, Dr. Jordan Dworkin. He just defended his thesis last week. So he's a newly minted doctor in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Pennsylvania, and Professor Taki Shinohara, who's also in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Pennsylvania. And Jordan's interests were in trying to understand the field of neuroimaging in general. What are the kinds of questions that we ask? How do we ask them? And how have the answers to those 2 questions changed over the course of time? And so what he did was that he took articles published in NeuroImage between the years of 2008 and 2017. He collated the keywords of those articles and all of the abstracts. And then he constructed a network from that information. The nodes inside of this network represented the 100 most common topics, and then meaning that they were present in the largest number of articles. And then the edges inside of this network represent the phi coefficient for binary association. And that represents the degree to which 2 topics tend to be discussed in the same articles. So if 2 topics are very commonly discussed in the same articles across that whole set of 8,547, then the phi coefficient is going to be very high. And if they're never discussed in the same article, then the phi coefficient will be 0. And at the bottom of this slide, I'm showing you 2 visualizations of that network. So on the left-hand side, you see an adjacency matrix visualization of the network. What that means is that there are the topics, the 100 topics along the X and Y axis, and then the color indicates the phi coefficient. What you can see by eye from this adjacency matrix is that there are clearly modules of topics that neuroimaging seems to address. So there's one module that we've colored in pink, and that's related to many topics in structural magnetic resonance imaging. There's a second topic in red, marked in red, which is related to lots of areas in functional magnetic resonance imaging. The module in yellow is really one that focuses on structures of the brain, both in cortex and subcortex and cerebellum. And then in light blue is a module that's largely focused on imaging modalities of EEG and MEG. And then in green is a smaller module that tends to focus predominantly on questions related to Alzheimer's disease. So that's what the adjacency matrix looks like. On the right-hand side, what you can see is a binarized version of that network where we've just shown the very strongest connections. And again, you can see the overall architecture, but also the presence of these sort of separate modules of topics that seem to be discussed in the same articles. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that that's the overall architecture across all 10 years of the study. But then what Jordan did was he said, well, let me see which topics seem to be increasing in prevalence with time and which tend to be decreasing in prevalence with time. And what you see here are 5 graphs. Each one is color-coded according to the module from the previous slide. So the pink one is the module that's mostly related to diffusion-weighted imaging or structural imaging. The red one is the functional imaging, and then throughout the rest. So what I want you to realize very interestingly is that there are specific topics that are being talked about more commonly. So if you just focus on the top left in the pink module, we see that diffusion-weighted imaging is certainly being talked about, being discussed and written about in neuroimaging papers in an increasing prevalence rate, whereas the cerebral cortex and voxel-based morphometry are being discussed less so in these papers. If you look at the red figure, what you see is that functional connectivity, resting state, and the default mode network are topics that are increasing in prevalence, whereas hemodynamic response and cerebral blood flow are decreasing in prominence over the last 10 years. In yellow, you see that the topics of cognitive control and transcranial magnetic stimulation are increasing in prevalence with time, whereas PET is decreasing in prevalence with time. And then in the blue at the bottom, you can see that topics related to oscillation and attention are increasing in the neuroimaging journal, whereas epilepsy is decreasing in the neuroimaging journal. And then in green, you see the topic of prediction is increasing, aligned with the increased interest in machine learning. And then in other topics like atrophy, for example, are actually decreasing in their prevalence with time. So this suggests that the field as a whole has a modular architecture. We can see that from the time averaged picture, but it also, there's some interesting dynamics here where we are following new kinds of questions and addressing new kinds of questions with new tools as time moves forward. Now, one interesting thing that we can do is try to determine whether the topics that are changing in prevalence could be predicted from the prevalence of their neighbors. And so what I'm showing you here is a graph that has all 100 topics, and then they're colored according to whether their prevalence is increasing faster than expected or decreasing more than expected. On the x-axis is the expected growth of that topic given the changing prevalence of the immediate neighbors of that topic. And then along the y-axis is the actual observed growth. So if you're above the line, that means that the observed growth or the observed increase in prevalence of that topic is greater than you would expect given the other topics that are connected to it inside of this network. So if you focus on that top part, so above the line, you see the notions of prediction, of default mode network, of the resting state, of functional connectivity, of oscillations and plasticity, and diffusion-weighted imaging, all increasing in prevalence much more quickly than we would anticipate given the neighboring topics. And then the topics that are decreasing, so that are not growing as quickly as we would expect, given their surrounding neighbors, are notions like atrophy, voxel-based morphometry, PET, effective connectivity, ICA, synchronization, and coherence. So this suggests to us that, yes, to some degree, you can predict the changing prevalence of topics from other topics that are discussed in the same papers, but there are some that are changing much more swiftly than expected, and others that are decreasing in prevalence more than would be expected. So there's a lot of heterogeneity here, much more than we can predict purely from the other topics in the paper itself. And one topic that I'm particularly interested in, but that also sticks out as very unusual in this work, is the topic of the word connectome. And what we did is that we actually found that in NeuroImage in 2008, there were no papers with the word connectome. And so I'm focused here on the left-hand plot here. And in orange, I'm showing you the prevalence of connectome in NeuroImage. You can see that it begins at 0 in 2008. So there were no papers that used the term connectome in 2008 in NeuroImage. But then as you move up to 2017, there's a drastic increase in prevalence of that particular term. And we were curious about whether that overall increase was something that was specific to the field of neuroimaging, or if it was more global than that across other journals that are tackling work across a broader field. And so we compared the results to what we would observe in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So again, on the left-hand side, just if you focus on the turquoise color, you're seeing the prevalence of the word connectome in PNAS as a function of time. And you can see that in 2008, there actually were papers that were using the term connectome. And then over the last 10 years, you can see that there's been a striking increase in the prevalence of that term that is certainly tracking neuroimage. It's interesting at the very, around 2015, there's a decrease in the use of connectome in PNAS, whereas in neuroimage it continues to increase. I would love to go back to this study and add in the data from the last 3 years to understand whether both continue to increase or whether the use of that term in PNAS has plateaued, whereas in neuroimaging it continues to go up. I'm curious. Right now, this particular data, this paper was published in 2018, and the data was taken up through 2017. Now, I want to focus on the right-hand side of this slide. So here, what we wanted to do was to understand whether neuroimage is tackling topics earlier than PNAS, or if PNAS is tackling topics earlier than neuroimage, and vice versa. So is there a way for us to understand whether there's a particular lead-lag relationship between a domain-specific journal, like NeuroImage, and a domain general journal, like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences? And so this figure on the right, if you look at the x-axis, you can see the percent change in prevalence of a term per month in NeuroImage, and then along the y-axis is the percent change in prevalence of a particular term per month in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So that allows us to explicitly compare each topic in those two journals. And in color, what you're seeing is the optimal offset in the two trajectories in PNAS or in NeuroImage. So if the optimal offset is blue, it means that the PNAS is leading by about 24 months, and in orange are topics where NeuroImage is leading by about 24 months. And then the size of the dot indicates the optimal correlation in the change in prevalence of each of those topics over this 10-year period. And so what you're seeing actually is that certainly there's a positive trend here. So topics that are increasing in prevalence in PNAS are also increasing in prevalence in NeuroImage. However, there's a lot of variability in whether NeuroImage is leading the field by having papers on that topic, or whether the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences are leading the field by having papers on that topic. So there really is not a clear lead-lag relationship across all topics. It's very topic dependent. So this is interesting. It suggests that we are tackling questions, the two sorts of journals, the general domain general, discipline general journals, and the discipline-specific journals are tackling questions of merit at different times and are not necessarily following one versus the other. All right, so that leads me to the question of, well, what's actually happening in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and can we learn something more generally about the way that science is done, not just in neuroimaging, but more broadly? And so what we did is that we used the same approach that we had for neuroimaging. In this case, we're taking 65,290 articles that were published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences between the year 2000 and the year 2017. And on the left-hand side is the adjacency matrix, just like we talked about before, where you can see the topics themselves along the X and Y axes, and then each element inside of this matrix is the phi coefficient that tells you whether those two topics have been found commonly in the same journal, in the same articles, or if the two topics were never found in the same article. And again, what I want you to focus on is the fact that along the diagonal, you can see clear block structure, which means that there are modules of topics. In this case, those modules of topics tend to be related to large disciplinary areas like cell biology or immunology or microbiology, genetics, evolution, neuroscience, chemistry, biochemistry, and the medical sciences more generally. So there's very clear modular structure where there are topics or papers that are in a particular discipline tend to talk about topics that are specific to that discipline. It's not perfect. Obviously, there's a lot of inter-module connectivity, and these are places where perhaps a method has been used in neuroscience and also been used in microbiology, or there's an important scientific question that requires a study from microbiology as well as a study from cell biology or genetics. And so that interdisciplinary part is shown in all of the off-diagonal edges that are present in this adjacency matrix. And in fact, we were very curious about whether that interdisciplinarity could be studied and whether it meant anything for the impact of the work in the field. And so what I'm showing you here is a very simple line plot that has two variables in it. The variable in green is the impact factor of the journal, PNAS, as a function of time from 2000 to 2016. And importantly, as you see along the y-axis, this is the residual impact factor. We've actually regressed out the number of papers that were published that year because the number of papers that were published in PNAS is a very good predictor of the impact factor of the journal. In the years where the journal publishes fewer papers, it has a lower impact. And in the years when the journal publishes more papers, it has a higher impact. And since that was a rather trivial driver, we regressed out that factor. So now you're just seeing the residual impact factor after regressing out the number of papers that were published per year in that journal. Okay, so that's the curve in green. And then the curve in sort of purple is a residual interdisciplinarity. So how did we measure interdisciplinarity? Well, PNAS is really interesting in that each of the articles is assigned to one or two or sometimes three different fields when it's published. So they have a tag. This is a paper that is partially applied mathematics and partially neuroscience. And so what we can do is that we can quantify that assignment of the article to a field. And we can determine how much our predictions of the field that the network is tackling is different from that classic assignment. So our measure of journal interdisciplinarity is the product of two things. It's the product of the network's small world propensity, and that allows us to take into account these connections that are present between different modules. How much connectivity is there between the modules? It's a product of that variable and the network's deviance from the classical partition. So the classical partition of these papers into the fields of applied mathematics, neuroscience, biology, etc. So every single temporal window here along the x-axis represents the degree to which the network has small world structure that is not well characterized by the assigned topic classification. And so what you can see very interestingly is that actually the impact factor is positively correlated with the interdisciplinarity. When we see the interdisciplinarity increase, we also see the impact factor increase. And when we see the interdisciplinarity decrease, we also see the impact factor decrease as well. So this is a really interesting indication that our field broadly is not just, or science in general, is not just, it doesn't just have a modular architecture, it doesn't just have a small world architecture, it doesn't just have time evolving topics, but also the impact of our ideas or the questions that we ask depend upon their interdisciplinary nature. And I think this is a wonderful indicator of, or motivator for continuing to support interdisciplinary work in the future. And so that covers the first topic that I really wanted to go over, which is just my enthusiasm about neuroimaging and science in general as fantastic time-evolving interdisciplinary fields. I next want to move.
Danny, can I ask one question before we move on, if that's okay?
Yeah,
it's in the chat box, and I think it's a little past the prime time of when the question was asked, and I think you touched on it somewhat, but might prevalence be journal or meeting dependent? And if you wanted to specifically address that.
Prevalence be journal, it's journal dependent here, yes.
Great.
Yep, thank you for the question. Okay, so then I wanted to move into neuroscience as it faces some inequities. And this work is led by the same fabulous first author, Jordan Dworkin, and also Professor Takeshi Nohara, but we've been joined by 3 other collaborators on this work, including Dr. Erin Teich, who's a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Kristen Lin, who's in the Biostatistics Department at the University of Pennsylvania, and then Professor Perry Zern, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at American University. And what Jordan was really interested in tackling with this work is to understand and sort of progress our understanding of gender inequities in academia. Now, there have been many wonderful prior reports of gender inequities in academia and industry in terms of compensation, grant funding, credit for collaborative work, teaching evaluations, hiring and promotions, productivity and authorship, and even citations. And in fact, neuroscience is a place a field, a subdiscipline that I think has been doing a great job of increasingly attempting to confront the pervasive gender imbalances. So we have groups like Bias Watch Neuro, which seeks to identify neuroscience conferences who have gender imbalances in their lineup of speakers. And we also have these repositories like Women in Neuroscience and Anne's List that provide wonderful databases of current women in neuroscience that can be helpful in learning more about one another, but also in ensuring that the people that we invite for our conference speaking roles are balanced in terms of gender. But actually, there's a further problem here, which is not just that inequities exist, but the fact that ongoing conversations about these inequities have largely focused on the role of people in positions of power. So for example, journal editors or grant reviewers in agencies, department chairs, and society presidents. And that's a little bit troubling just because many of the imbalances that are present in the field are caused and perpetuated by researchers at all levels. And so all of us actually have some individual responsibility, but that's not being talked about as much as the responsibilities of people in positions of power. And so we wanted to tackle one particular kind of imbalance that is perpetuated by researchers at all levels, and that is imbalance within citation practices, where people from marginalized groups are broadly undercited relative to people from non-marginalized groups. And because of the downstream effects that citations can have on visibility and career advancement, understanding and eliminating gender bias in citation practices is really vital for understanding and addressing inequities in the scientific community. Now, you could also say that, well, you know, if we get rid of the dependence on citations and the impact factor and make sure that we scrape all that information from CVs before we send the CVs to the promotion and tenure committees, or before we go to send it to the awards committees, or et cetera, then maybe we can circumvent this whole issue. But I actually think that citations it's more than citations. Citations is kind of the observable behavior that is and there's something much deeper behind it. And I'm going to call it the further problem. So we tend as a race to choose new research directions from very highly cited papers, and that's work by many different labs, but it was reviewed most recently by Fortunato in Science. And then number two, papers that are written by men are cited more than papers that are written by women, and that's also been reported by many different groups. So we actually tend to answer questions that are posed by men, and thus the trajectory of scientific discovery and the crystallization of collective knowledge is biased away from the ideas that are produced by minority thinkers. And again, this topic's also been written about a lot, but I wanted to point out a paper that was just recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from Hofstra et al. This year, 2020, that reports that demographically underrepresented students innovate at a higher rate than majority students, but their contributions are discounted and less likely to earn them academic positions. So there is certainly this very pervasive finding that the ideas of minority thinkers are kind of bypassed and are not treated as central to the trajectory of science moving forward. And so I think that citations is something that is just a behavior that shows what kind of questions we're asking, and we should consider whether those questions are the questions of all humans or whether they're only the questions of a privileged few. Okay, so to get to our approach to this question, we really wanted to determine whether there's evidence of gender bias in the citation practices of neuroscientists. And to address that question, we examined the authors and reference lists of 61,416 articles that were published since 1995 till now in five top neuroscience journals. These are the ones that were listed on Web of Science as having the highest eigenvector scores, and they include Nature Neuroscience, Neuron, Brain, Journal of Neuroscience, and NeuroImage. So all of the data that I'm going to show you in this section is from those 5 journals. Now, in order to understand whether there is gender imbalance, we need to be able to assign gender to the authors. And what we did is that we assigned gender to first names using the gender package in R with the Social Security Administration baby name dataset. And for names that were not included in that dataset, we used a gender API to assign gender to the first names. Specifically, how we did it is that we assigned the term man or the term woman to each author if their name had a probability that was greater than or equal to 0.7 of belonging to someone labeled as a man or as a woman according to the source. So according to the Social Security Administration baby name dataset or to the gender API dataset. In the SSA dataset, the man and woman labels correspond to the sex assigned to children at birth. In the gender API dataset, the man and woman labels correspond to a combination of sex assigned at birth and genders that are detected on social media profiles. So the gender API dataset is a little bit more, includes more information in determining the gender of a name. Now, a few important notes before I dig into the data. I want to emphasize that in gender theory, sex often refers to physical attributes as determined anatomically and physiologically, while gender often refers to self-identity as expressed behaviorally or in social cultural context. In our particular analysis, when I use the term gender, it does not refer directly to the sex of the author, as assigned at birth or as chosen later, and it does not directly refer to the gender of the author as socially assigned or as self-chosen. When I use the term gender, what I mean is a function of the probability of the assigned gender names. We do not actually know the sex or gender of any of these authors. Now, a second point I wanted to make is that the work is limited in terms of diversity and inclusion, and I want to put this up front and acknowledge it. Even though we're trying to support diversity and inclusion, there are limitations here. So the method that we used for gender determination are limited to a binary man-woman assignment. So the study design is not well accommodated to intersex, transgender, and or non-binary identities. And it incorrectly assumes that all authors in the data set can be placed into one of these two categories. Ideally, future work will be able to move beyond this gender binary, potentially by applying methods that utilize pronouns or other forms of self-identification. Okay, so with those 2 points made, let's just take a look at the data. So here are the predicted genders of authors over time across these 5 journals and the 61,416 articles. What you can see is that the proportion of articles in these different gender categories is changing over time. So in purple, you're seeing the percentage of papers that have a man first author and a man last author. You can see in 1995, that was about 64%. And in 2018, it's about 50%. And so that's indicating the growing diversity of the field, which is great. In the sort of turquoise colors, you see papers that have a woman first author and a man last author. And in the light turquoise, you see papers that have a man first author and a woman last author. And then in this burnt orange color, you see the papers that have a woman first author and a woman last author. Now that's the smallest category, but it is still growing. It started about 7% in 1995 and has increased to about 10% in 2018. The average rate of increase of the articles with a woman as either a first or last author is about 0.6% per year. Now we can break that picture down into each journal, each of the 5. So I have Journal of Neuroscience, Nature Neuroscience, Neuron, Brain, and NeuroImage. What's interesting here is that Journal of Neuroscience, Brain, and NeuroImage all show significant increases of the number of papers that have a woman as either first or last author. And those increases are about 0.65% to 1.2% per year. Neuron shows an increase of 0.29% per year, so not as large as the other 3 journals. And then Nature Neuroscience actually shows no significant increase. So the mean increase was 0.19%, but the confidence interval that's derived by bootstrapping includes 0, so we can't say that there is any significant increase in the number of papers that are being published in Nature Neuroscience that have a woman as first or last author. Now, with that data, we wanted to test 4 hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that the overall citation rate of women-led papers, which I'm going to define here as those with women as first and or last author, we predict that that overall citation rate will be lower than expected given papers' relevant characteristics. And that prediction or that hypothesis is based on work in other fields, including astronomy, political science, and international relations, but has not been tested in neuroscience before. The second hypothesis that we had was that the undercitation of women-led papers will occur to a greater extent within men-led reference lists. And that hypothesis is again supported by work in other fields, but has not been tested yet in neuroscience. Number 3, we predicted that the undercitation of women-led papers will be decreasing over time because the field is diversifying, but perhaps at a slower rate within men-led reference lists. And then number 4, we hypothesized that differences in undercitation between men-led and women-led reference lists will be partly explained by the structure of authors' social networks. So let's test hypothesis 1, the undercitation of women in general. Well, for each of the 31,418 citing papers between 2009 and 2018, we took the subset of its citations that had been published in one of those 5 journals since 1995. We determined the gender of the cited first and last authors. We removed all the self-citations because we didn't want those to cloud the picture. We really want to understand how people are citing others, not whether they're citing themselves, although I have some data on that I can share with you as well. And then last, we calculated the number of the cited papers that fell into each of these 4 first author, last author gender categories. So man, woman, woman, or woman. Now here what you're seeing is the estimation of the over or under citation. To obtain a number that would be expected, a number of citations that would be expected, we said, well, let's just assume that reference lists are random draws from the literature. This is a very simplistic assumption, but let's go with it, and then I'll show you a more sophisticated model on the next slide. Assuming it's a random draw from the literature, we can calculate the gender proportions among all of the papers published prior to the citing paper, so thus representing the proportion among the entire pool of papers that the authors could have cited, and we multiplied them by the number of papers cited. So on the y-axis here, on the right-hand side, you see the percent over or under citation, and then along the x-axis is the gender author category. So what you see is that man papers are overcited by 11.6%. Woman-man papers are undercited by 10.1%. Man-woman papers are undercited by 12.5%. And then the woman-woman papers, so that's that burnt orange again, are undercited by 30.2%. So these are sort of eye-popping numbers. Now, an interesting question is this enough, or are reference lists not random draws from the literature? Well, clearly they're not random draws from the literature, and so what might be important is to actually include some expectations from paper features. And I think there are at least 5 different features of a paper that might be relevant to us as we're choosing what to cite. The first one would be the year of publication. The second one is the journal in which it is published. If it's in a really good journal, it may be more likely to be cited. Number 3, the number of authors on the paper. Number 4, whether the paper was a review article or not. Often review articles are more heavily cited than empirical papers. And then number 5, the seniority of the paper's first and last authors. Now, we don't have the age of the authors in this data set, so as a proxy, we used the number of papers that they've published previously. So that's our proxy for their seniority in the field. And what you can see here is the results of a generalized additive model on the multinomial outcome of paper authorship in the 4 author categories, accounting for those 5 characteristics. What you can see is that the man-man papers are still overcited, this time by 5.2%. The women-man papers are undercited by 6.7%. The man-woman papers are undercited by 4.6%, and the woman-woman papers are undercited by 13.9%. So the overall trends still hold, although they're not as large as when you had assumed that the citations are just random draws from the literature. So that allows us to move on to hypothesis 2, so that women are undercited, their undercitation being driven mostly by man-man teams. And again, this is just motivated by work that's been found in that's been reported in other fields. What we find is that yes, the undercitation of women does seem to be driven largely by the citation practices of man-man teams, consistent with those other fields. So on the left-hand side here, you're seeing if we just look at the papers that have a man first author and a man last author, what are their citation practices to these 4 gender author categories? And then on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is any paper that has a woman as first author, last author, or both. And what you can see is that the overall overcitation of man-man teams and undercitation of women-women teams is very present on the left-hand side. So when we just consider the papers that have a man first author and a man last author, but the citing practices of the women teams are actually fairly flat. So there isn't as much of a overcitation of the man-man teams or undercitation of the women-women teams. So that's consistent with the hypothesis. Then I want to make 2 points about logic here, just so that you know that I completely acknowledge these points. Number 1 is the fact that imbalance is driven largely by the citation practices of man-man teams does not mean that all men-led teams have imbalanced citation practices. So we actually looked inside of the data set and we found Professor Guy Irvin, who has a citation practice that is actually the inverse of the field in general, or his gender. What we actually find is that he tends to overcite the women-women papers and undercite the man-man papers. So his citation practices are in color, and then in the dashed black lines are what we would have expected. So he's bucking the trend. The second point I want to make is the fact that the women-led teams are not driving the imbalance doesn't mean that all women-led teams have balanced citation practices. And so women, we cannot hide behind our gender and saying, well, we don't have to worry about this, we're not the problem. In fact, I actually had Jordan go through the data and look at my citation practices, and what you can see, very embarrassingly, is that I massively undercite women teams, more than would be expected on average from a general author. So this is not something to be proud of, but I think emphasizes the fact that all of us have an individual responsibility to assess our own citation practices and then try to do something to change it. And I'll get to some of the tools that we've been building to help address this disparity in the last part of the talk. So testing hypothesis number 3, decreasing imbalance over time. We find that actually the imbalance within reference lists is increasing over time. So this is contrary to our hypothesis. We had thought, well, the field is diversifying, surely an imbalance in citation practices should be decreasing with time, but actually it's increasing. And it's increasing most in the papers that have a man first author and a man last author. So on the left-hand side, again, you're seeing just the papers that have a man first author and a man last author. Who are they citing? Well, they're mostly citing, they're over-citing the man-man teams and under-citing the women-women teams, but in a way that's increasing with time, not decreasing in time. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is when we just look at the papers that have a woman either as first author, last author, or both, and you can see that their citation practices are staying relatively flat in comparison with those of the man-man teams. So this gap between the observed and expected man-man proportions has been growing at a rate of roughly 0.41 percentage points per year. And within man-man reference lists, that rate is 0.54, whereas within the women-led reference lists, that difference is 0.29. Okay, testing hypothesis 4, the impact of social networks. So it's actually well known that researchers are more likely to work with other researchers of their own gender, and this homophily in co-authorship networks can possibly produce biased perceptions of the overall gender makeup of a network. So maybe, you know, we each work with other people from our own gender, and then we kind of assume that the world is more of our gender than it actually is. And so we wanted to know whether that altered perception could perhaps be explaining some of the results that we found. So to address that, we quantified the man-author overrepresentation statistic. And we define that to be the difference between two numbers. The first number is the proportion of men within paper P's author neighborhood. So that's defined as the union of researchers who had previously co-authored a paper with either the first or the last author of paper P. And then number 2, the overall proportion of men within the network at the time of P's publication. So that helps us to understand whether for that particular paper there was an overrepresentation of man authorship in the reference lists, even given the social network or co-authorship network around the people publishing the paper. And here what you can see is that this overrepresentation of men within co-authorship networks is certainly present. So notice that every single one of these lines is above 0, which means that male authors are being overrepresented in the reference lists. But interestingly, again, that's driven mostly by papers that have a man first author and a man last author. So in yellow are the papers that have a first author man and a last author man. And you can see that those have the highest man author overrepresentation in their reference lists than the papers that have a woman first author and a woman last author, which are shown in blue. Now, we wanted to know whether that was enough to address the impact of social networks or co-authorship networks in driving these effects. And so to do that, we defined one more statistic, and that is the man-man paper overrepresentation. So again, this is another statistic that is defined as a difference, and it's the difference between two variables. The first variable is the proportion of man-man papers within P's paper neighborhood, defined as the union of all papers written by P's first author, last author, or any of the previous co-authors. And then number 2, the overall proportion of man-man papers within the network at the time of P's publication. Now what we can do is that we can just study that paper representation, and that's what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side. So the median MM over citation is something that's clearly strongest in yellow, so that's in the man-man papers, and it's weakest in the women-led papers, with women as first and last author, that's shown in blue. But we can actually estimate the over or under citation of papers that being conditional on these two metrics of the co-authorship network. So both the man-author overrepresentation and the man-man paper overrepresentation. And that's what I'm showing you on the right-hand side. So if we condition on those two being accounted for, what you can see is that we still, in color, have over representation of the man-man papers and less representation of the women-women papers. So our results suggest that this local homophily explains a part of the overcitation of men by other men, but not everything. There's still significant variability that's, or variation that's not being explained. So there's something more than the co-authorship network that is going on here. So that brings me to kind of a middle statement here, that some explanations and some non-explanations. I realize we're getting close to the end here. The undercitation of women in neuroscience papers may be due to systemic gender bias or to explicit or implicit individual bias relative either to the known gender of the author or to an author's gendered name. Overrepresentation of men in course syllabi and conference speaking roles is clearly a factor in gender disparity in academia, but this mechanism is not consistent with the fact that overcitation of men differs based on the gender of the citing authors. So if we're all seeing the same people in course syllabi and we're seeing the same speaker at the conferences, then our citation practices should be the same. But in fact, our observation that there's gender differences and that much of this overcitation is happening from the man-man teams suggests that there's something more than just who we are being exposed to in syllabi and conference speaking roles. Number 3, the growing gender gap that we see does not simply reflect authors' propensity to cite older literature from when the field was more men-dominated, as the expected proportions that we use account for the publication year of the articles being cited. So that can't be an explanation. And lastly, homophily in social networks can produce biased perceptions of the overall gender makeup of a network, but we find that this homophily explains only part of the other overcitation of men by other men. So there are a couple common questions that are asked. What happens if you retain or remove self-citations? Could this all be driven by a male-dominated subfield? And could it be driven by high-impact papers rather than being a systemic effect across papers of all impact levels? And I think given the time, I'm going to skip those slides, but feel free to ask about them in the question and answer period, because I wanted to just end with some tools for mitigating disparity. Now that we've seen the disparity, I want to give you some tools to address it. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a couple places that we can go. Number one is that I do acknowledge that this work has only focused on the high impact journals, these 5 journals specifically, and we don't know if this effect is also present in medium impact journals or low impact journals. So that's something that we should address in the future. Number 2, I've just focused on neuroscience. There are many other scientific fields that you and I contribute to, and so it would be nice to understand the practices there in science as culture and what we can do to make it better. And lastly, we need to also be addressing other dimensions of potential disparity. And in addition to gender, race and ethnicity is one that is particularly important, and there are pervasive effects of pervasive disparities in race and ethnicity that we should understand. So I'm not going to go through these data either, but we have some initial evidence to suggest that there is also racial imbalance in citation practices in neuroscience as well. And that brings me to actions. What can we do about it as a scientific community? Well, the first thing that I think we can do is just to increase awareness, which is partly why I'm giving this talk. But also another thing that we're doing to increase awareness is to include a citation diversity statement at the end of each of our papers. So at the end of each of our papers, we have a statement that looks like this. Recent work in neuroscience and other fields has identified a bias in citation practices such that papers from women and other minorities are undercited relative to the number of such papers in the field. Here we sought to proactively consider choosing references that reflect the diversity of the field in thought, in gender, geography, seniority, and other factors. We used automatic classification of gender based on the first names of the first and last authors, with possible combinations being man-man, man-woman, woman-man, and woman-woman. excluding self-citations to the first and last authors of our current paper. The references contain this many man-man, this many man-woman, this many woman-man, and this many woman-woman. We look forward to future work that could help us to better understand how to support equitable practices in science. And really interestingly, Trends in Cognitive Science, the journal, is the first to publish a formal citation diversity statement with one of their papers, and it's this paper from Nicole Rust and Meripur, just published last month. So I'm really excited that Trends in Cognitive Science is leading internationally in that way. The second thing that we can do is that we've developed publicly available user-friendly software that's executable from any internet browser. This is work that was led by Dale Zoe, who's a PhD candidate in my group in the field of neuroscience. You can go to his GitHub. It provides you with this executable software that you can apply to your bibliography to understand what your proportions are. And you can use that to inform the citation diversity statement or just to inform yourself of what the proportions are in your paper. And lastly, Jenny Stiso has developed a Chrome extension for Google Scholar. So now when you type in a particular search term in Google Scholar, it'll come up with all of the papers that Google would normally provide to you, but it will also pull out the first and last authors and tell you the predictions of their gender using these same tools. And we're hoping that that's useful as people consider citing a diverse array of individuals in their reference lists. I think there's also a lot of work to be done, not just in the scientific community, but also in the classroom, potentially educating graduate students and undergraduate students about the ethics of citation practices, perhaps in the responsible conduct of research modules that NSF and NIH support. And I think that leads to the question of what is an ethical research practice in citations? And I completely acknowledge that the ethics of citation practices, I think, remains to be further defined. Writing social inequities can be accomplished by several different models, and there are two that I wanted to leave you with: the distributional model, which I'm showing you in purple here, and then the difference model in blue. A distributional model, in a distributional model, justice refers to the morally proper distribution of social goods and resources, which in this case would be the citations. And it kind of has two different subcomponents. If you focus on an equality-based distributed model, then citations ought to be allocated to all authors equally, while in the equity-based distributed model, citations ought to be allocated to authors differentially based upon select factors, which may include merit, need, or authority. The distributional model and both of its subtypes, I think, are quite limited by emphasizing commodity parity across economies of exchange, rather than differential responsibility for histories and structures of inequality. And I think if we want to address these histories and structures of inequality, then we could instead consider what's called the difference model, which recommends acts of reparative justice, which might include affirmative action in citation practices, institutional reform to support citation parity, and disciplinary redress of gender bias more broadly. So with that, I'd like to leave you with just the point that the work of citation is an important element in the research ethics of any field. It doesn't just address whether or not somebody gets an award. It's actually about the questions that are being asked and the trajectory of scientific inquiry. Insofar as citation patterns today have inescapable effects on the future of neuroscience as a field, citation practices in the field warrant more serious consideration. If you're interested in the data and code that we used for this study, I've put the citation down here at the bottom of the slide. You feel free to have a look and see what we've done and use it for any other questions that you might have. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the team one more time. I've included all of the people from the first couple papers on neuroimaging as a field and topics. That was Jordan Dworkin and Takeshi Nohara. I've also included the people who were on the paper for the extent of gender imbalance in neuroscience reference lists. And I also included Dale and Jenny, who are the two graduate students who are developing the tools for mitigating disparity. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I would love to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try once more to try to unmute everyone and see how it fails or works. Let me try this again. You can unmute it yourself while I'll try to go through my different monitors and unmute everyone. I think you're unmuted, so Round of applause to Danny. Thank you very much. I'm going to mute back. Sluggish. I apologize. My response is quite sluggish. Huh. I'm going to mute everyone. So I'm going to turn to some questions here if I can ever get back to my other monitor, which I'm not succeeding. I apologize. All right, so I would love to ask some questions that I received earlier, and some are related to the a section that you talked about at the end, but let's see. So I'm concerned that there will be ethnic disparities due to the difficulties of recognizing gender from names in many East Asian cultures. I think you addressed some of it, but would you like to add anything further? This is from Dr. Snyder. You might be muted. I apologize. I muted everyone. Danny, do you want to unmute yourself?
All right, yes. Yes, so absolutely. The Gender API has actually been developed to address terms or names from, I think, 80 different countries. And that includes several East Asian countries. And so there is certainly we're not using a tool that was developed solely for Anglican names, for example. However, I think that certainly more work can be done here. In the supplement of the paper, Jordan provides a manual assessment. So he took 200 names of scholars from the database, and he just chose those 200 randomly, and then went to their individual web pages to determine the pronouns that they used on their web page. And you can see the results in the supplement. He finds something like 98% accuracy in the automatic classification and the manual looking up their pronouns.
Great.
That includes people from other countries.
Thank you. I'm going to try to go to the next question. Natasha says, I'm curious about your thoughts on a potential variable that may also be contributing to the citation gap. On the one hand, members of underrepresented groups are more likely to contribute in a more innovative way. For example, according to Hofstra et al. 2020 PNAS, and on the other hand, academia seem to be surprisingly hesitant to incorporate innovative approaches, theoretical ideas, and so on.
Yeah, there is a lot of work suggesting that the ideas from minority thinkers can be sort of on the edge of current topics that are being asked. But I feel like this is a circular problem, that maybe they're on the edge because nobody's taking up those ideas and bringing them to the center. And so I don't know, it's hard to determine what's the chicken and what's the egg in that problem. I think having more of an understanding of the content of each of these papers to quantify how central versus peripheral they are to the topics in the field would be very interesting. So that would basically combine the work in this project and the work that I talked about at the very beginning of the talk.
Yeah, thank you. And a couple of questions from Ted, I think is his first name. Number one, I entered academics, neonatology and neuroscience in the late 70s. For meetings, there was an old boys network. Who you were aligned with influenced whether your work would be presented. This has gone away in many fields of pediatrics. I think it's a comment more. Number two, during my career, I have been fortunate enough to have some great mentors, both men and women. All of us have shared the one concept, excellence in science. My sabbatical was with Maria Della Vioria Papu, I'm horrible with names, I apologize, Papadopoulos at University of Pittsburgh, and my current colleagues is Holly Fitch at UConn. Number three, maybe I am leftover hippie or civil rights person of the 60s, but I think that the issue of sex in publication should take a backseat to excellence first. I don't know if you had any comments or if you want to just take that in and move forward.
Maybe something that I can do is just show one of the slides that I was not able to show, which is, are these effects largely being driven by high impact papers? So is it the high impact papers that are driving the effects, or is it across papers of all impact? And this is related to the question of excellence, if you equate excellence and impact, which of course we don't, but it is somewhat of a proxy, although we just leave that there. So what you're just seeing here is on the left-hand side, the citation percent over and under citation, and then each of the gender author categories. And you can see in the darker color, just the findings from the highly cited papers, and then the lighter colors, just this findings from the below median cited papers. And what you can see is the general over and under citation is still present, both for the highly cited papers and for the median or below cited papers. And again, on the right-hand side, you're seeing that on the top, it's driven mostly by the man-man teams and not so much by the women-led teams. So this suggests that it's something that is very pervasive.
Can I make a comment, as I've unmuted myself?
Please.
Yeah, two of the grandparents of neonatology are Maria Davoria Papadopoulos, who spent her career at University of Pennsylvania. The other was William O., who was at Brown. Both of these were minority. Maria was from France and Greece. She worked in the Greek underground in World War II. Bill migrated from the Philippines. So I have a man and a woman, both minorities, who are clearly recognized as the greats of neonatology and neuroscience for that particular field. So I'm a little bit offended by this. And as our moderator knows, I've worked with Holly Fitch for the last 13 years. And our goal for all of us has always been the science first. I really don't care about someone's sex, gender.
I appreciate that you don't care about people's sex or gender, and that you want to focus on the science first. I think that is clearly laudable. But I also, and I do know that there are many people who have, who are minorities in the field and who have made it. This is a particular statement that's quantitative, that's statistical from these 5 journals, and it's the data, so I'm reporting the data.
So maybe we need to look at some of the other specialties in science.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. We did look at the Journal of Neuroscience because it does have subfields, including cellular neuroscience, computational neuroscience, systems neuroscience, and others, just to determine whether or not the effect is consistent across subfields or differs across subfields, at least in that particular journal. And what we see is that the effects are actually fairly consistent across all of those subdisciplines. So here we're including the subdiscipline inside of the GAM, the generalized additive model. And what we see, at least for Journal of Neuroscience papers, is that whether we include the topic category or don't include the topic category, the results are still the same, roughly.
And also, it seems like it's important to acknowledge the major implicit biases that are unknown to the individual even who are doing these kind of citation practices. If you ask them overtly, they will answer one thing and their citation practice will show another thing. So I think some of this quantitative work nicely highlights some of that. But thank you very much for all the comments and questions. We will move on. What is the name of the Chrome extension that you mentioned? We would love to use it.
Yes, if you, we're in beta testing now, so if you're willing to beta test it for us, that would be amazing. Send me an email and I will give you access. Thank you.
I get a lot of emails, but amazing work. Thank you very much. A number of those comments, and then thank you for the great talk. I was curious if you have, this is from a person called Kelly. I was curious if you have considered the role of search practices and considerations of what we cite. Google Scholar, PubMed, etc. have complex ranking systems and many people do not go past a few pages of results. What roles does this particularly sorting algorithms play? Should we be searching differently on new platforms? Thanks for the development of tools. They are a great addition.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So Google Scholar will tend to show you papers that are more highly cited rather than papers that are not as highly cited. That's part of it. It's not the only part of the search algorithm, but so I think that that's a little bit tricky because it's possible that that increases the potential for imbalance. I think that certainly searching is a good idea, but also being aware of the people in the field from different genders and from different races is important. And perhaps that's something that we can just include more of in our work moving forward. I think it's interesting because when we put together papers, I realized that we go through every figure so carefully to get the colors right and to get the axes right and to get every single sentence we go over hundreds of times to make sure that it's clearly displaying our meaning and yet also being accessible to other individuals. But our reference list we've kind of ignored, meaning my lab, until Jordan did this work. And so I think it's something that we can put a little bit more thought into. Part of that will be search engines, but part of it will just be making ourselves aware of the people in the field.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we're going to stop here. I'm going to give one more chance for everyone to clap, but I just wanted to say at the very end, if you're interested, Danny is giving another talk in 2 weeks, same time, same registration, access to Zoom, and she'll be talking about neuroimaging and dynamic networks, I believe. And so we're very much looking forward to it. And thank you very much